Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Earlier I did a video outlining the comedy of errors by Union forces at Ball's Bluff. Today it's the Confederates' turn. When Confederate troops set out to retaliate against Union soldiers at Fort Pickens, they began a comedy of errors that was played out in the sand dunes of Santa Rosa Island. The stakes were no laughing matter. Control of the port city of Pensacola. When Florida seceded from the Union on January 10, 1861, the new Confederacy viewed Pensacola's naval shipyard and railroad link as an invaluable asset to the Southern cause. On January 12th, Florida and Alabama state troops, along with many local citizens, forced U.S. Commodore James Armstrong to surrender the naval shipyard. In the bargain, the Southerners also acquired a $1 million dry dock, workshops, warehouses, barracks, a hospital, and 175 cannons, projectiles, and ordnance stores. The shipyard and nearby railroad were indeed great prizes, but the federal occupation of Fort Pickens, which commanded the harbor at the mouth of the Pensacola Bay, nullified all these advantages. As long as federal forces held Fort Pickens, the Confederates would not be able to use Pensacola harbor effectively. Deprived of any shipments of goods and materials via the harbor, the railroad would be of little value in helping to supply the rebel armies in the field, and the enemy presence at the fort posed a constant danger to any Confederate activity at the shipyard. Lying at the western tip of Santa Rosa Island, Fort Pickens, like Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, presented a dilemma for Abraham Lincoln and his new administration. Both forts were occupied by federal troops in rebel territory. Fort Pickens, however, lay on the seacoast and could easily be reinforced by sea, whereas Fort Sumter, located well inside Charleston Harbor, could be cut off from naval support by well-placed Confederate artillery batteries around the harbor. Fort Pickens could also be isolated as long as the United States had a strong navy. At the beginning of 1861, Fort Pickens stood empty. Fort McRae, across the harbor inlet from Fort Pickens, was occupied by a caretaker and his wife. The only U.S. troops in Pensacola, a small garrison of artillerists of Company G, 1st U.S. Artillery, were quartered in Fort Barrancas, an old Spanish fort just west of town. Their commander, Lieutenant Adam J. Slemmer, recognized his precarious position. He learned that Florida troops were gathering in town, and he suspected that Fort Barrancas would be seized along with the nearby naval shipyard. Shortly before midnight on January 8, 1861, guards at Fort Barrancas fired shots at figures lurking near the fort. Slemmer, fearing for the safety of the garrison, sensed that further hostilities were imminent. He reported that 20 men had been seen, although later accounts indicated that there were only 2. At any rate, these first shots of the war spurred Slemmer into action. On January 10th, the same day Florida seceded, Slemmer, with the support of Commodore Armstrong, evacuated his 51 soldiers along with the 30 sailors from the shipyard and transported them to Fort Pickens. Named after the Revolutionary War General Andrew Pickens, the fort was built to accommodate 250 guns and 1,200 men. Slemmer believed it would be the easiest of the 3 forts to defend and eventually reinforce. 2 days later, the Florida troops occupied Fort Barrancas and McRee. Any immediate attack on Fort Pickens was forestalled by the so-called Buchanan Truce. Under this agreement, negotiated by U.S. Senator Stephen Mallory of Pensacola and President James Buchanan, who was still in office in January of 1861, secessionists would not attempt to seize the fort as long as federal reinforcements were not landed there. Temporarily safe from attack, Slemmer refused 3 Confederate demands for surrender. The political situation, however, was rapidly changing, and the fragile truce did not last long. Lincoln was inaugurated as president in March of 1861, and he immediately ordered Union troops to reinforce Fort Pickens. In April, the same month that the Confederates bombarded Fort Sumter, Slemmer's tiny garrison was reinforced by several companies, and Colonel Harvey Brown was put in command of the fort. Meanwhile, on March 11th, General Braxton Bragg had assumed command of the approximately 7,000 Confederate troops in the Pensacola area. Bragg was a capable trainer and organizer of troops, and he lost no time in fortifying positions along the waterfront. He was unhappy, however, about his raw recruits' lack of discipline and experience. Bragg contemplated attacking Fort Pickens, but did not believe he had the necessary means to mount a full-scale siege. He also knew that the Federal Navy had complete control of the Gulf, and thus believed that the fort would be untenable even if captured. Bragg failed to fully appreciate the fort's strategic potential. Fort Barracas and McRae were not sufficient to fully control the harbor. Without Fort Pickens, the Confederate occupation of Pensacola was meaningless, and Bragg could not take advantage of the military and commercial benefits of the harbor. Events were taking shape, however, that soon would force Bragg's hand. On September 14, 1861, the Confederate schooner Judea, moored to a wharf at the naval shipyard, was boarded and set ablaze by a raiding party from USS Colorado. Federal naval officers had learned that Judea was being outfitted as a privateer and determined to destroy her before she could be put to sea. Judea was set on fire, and 3 of the Yankee raiders were killed. In retaliation for the burning of the schooner, Bragg ordered an attack on the Federal fortifications on Santa Rosa Island. His soldiers were restless and eager to have a go at the Yankees. Bragg ordered Brigadier General Richard H. Anderson to assemble an expeditionary force of about 1,100 men for the sortie. Although he wanted to punish the Yankees for the egregious deed, Bragg seems to have no intentions of attempting to capture Fort Pickens itself. In a letter to his wife dated October 10th, he declared that it was Billy Wilson and his crowd that I fondly hoped to destroy. Colonel William Wilson and 5 companies, C, D, F, H, and K, of the 6th New York Volunteers, were encamped about a mile east of Fort Pickens. Wilson, a New York City politician, was a colorful character, and his Zouaves were an undisciplined and unruly lot. The regimental mascot was a billy goat, which had been taught to butt with force and precision. Wilson's forces numbered 14 officers and 220 men. Other estimates put Wilson's force at closer to 400 effectives. However, these estimates may have included Company G, which was posted not in the camp but at nearby Battery Lincoln. Moreover, the regiment's ranks had been thinned somewhat by sickness caused by bad water and the hot Florida sun. Anderson ordered his selected detachments of troops to assemble at the naval shipyard on the evening of October 8th. There they embarked aboard the wood-burning steamer Time for the short ride to Pensacola. While en route, the troops were divided into 3 battalions. Anderson placed Colonel James R. Chalmers of the 9th Mississippi Regiment in command of the 1st Battalion, 350 strong. The 2nd Battalion, numbering 400 soldiers, was placed under the command of Colonel J. Patton Anderson of the 1st Regiment of Florida Volunteers. Colonel John K. Jackson, 5th Regiment, Georgia Volunteers, assumed command of the 260-man 3rd Battalion. An independent company of 53 men under Lieutenant James H. Hallenquist, lightly armed with pistols and knives, was equipped for spiking cannons and burning enemy structures. In addition, a detail of medical officers and support personnel accompanied the expedition. Upon arrival at Pensacola at 10 p.m., Anderson transferred a portion of his force to the steamer Ewing and several barges so that the troops could be landed more quickly on Santa Rosa Island. A third steamer, Nephi, was requisitioned to assist with the barges. Shortly after midnight, on October 9th, the flotilla departed for Santa Rosa Island. The harbor crossing was swift and uneventful, and the troops landed at about 2 a.m. on a secluded beach roughly 4 miles east of Fort Pickens. Once ashore, the battalions mustered around their respective commanders, and Anderson set his plan in motion. He directed Chalmers to advance westward along the northern shore of the island. Patton Anderson's battalion was to cross the narrow strip of the island and turn westward along its southern Gulf shore. Jackson was instructed to follow in the rear of Chalmers' battalion. At the first sign of contact with the enemy, he was to move to the center of the island and deploy his battalion as a link between the other two. Hollenquist followed in the rear of Jackson's column. Anderson hoped to locate and rout Wilson Zouaves, overrun their cantonment, and destroy the fortified batteries that lay between the cantonment and Fort Pickens. There is no indication that the general's plan called for any offensive action against the fort. The long march in the darkness over shifting sand dunes peppered with prickly pear cactus and sand spurs was toilsome and fatiguing for the soldiers. Still, the 3 southern columns moved quickly and quietly. The element of surprise was critical to the success of the mission. To enable themselves to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, the Confederates tied strips of white cloth around their left arms. At about 3:30 a.m., scouts from Chalmers' column were fired upon by a lone Zouave sentinel. The shot went wild, and the sentry was quickly dispatched, but the alarm had been sounded. Wilson hastened to form his command on the parade ground in front of the camp hospital. Guards informed him that about 2,000 men in 2 columns were marching upon us, that the pickets were all attacked at about the same time. Wilson immediately sent his orderly to Fort Pickens to inform Brown of the situation. The sound of gunfire was Jackson's cue to advance toward the center of the island. He ordered his men to fix bayonets and led them forward, sweeping aside the Federal pickets. They arrived at the Zouave cantonment, dubbed Camp Brown by the Federals, ahead of the other 2 battalions. The Zouaves were taken completely by surprise in their tents. The sight of Jackson's charging troops was too much for the ill-trained volunteers to bear. They wavered under the heavy fire and fled toward batteries Totten and Lincoln. Wilson did his best to rally his panic-stricken men, but was unable to check their flight. Elated at their easy triumph, the rebels stopped to plunder the evacuated camp. In doing so, however, they lost the precious momentum they needed to complete their victory. It was not long before battalions of Chalmers and Patton Anderson joined in the pillage of Camp Brown. The camp was thoroughly looted, and a great deal of property was stolen or destroyed. By 4 a.m., Hollenquist's men had spiked a number of cannons and set the camp ablaze. Amid the chaos, General Anderson reassembled his troops. He quickly realized, however, that his plan for attacking the Federal batteries near the fort was impractical. Dawn was near, and the Federals were alert and ready. In the morning light, his steamers would be easy targets for the Union gunboats in the bay. There simply was not enough time to mount a successful assault. Anderson therefore abandoned his original plan and issued orders for a full and orderly retreat back to the steamers. Meanwhile, at Fort Pickens, Brown sounded the alarm and readied his garrison to repel the invaders. After ensuring that the ramparts were manned, he ordered Major Israel Zouaves to take 2 companies of regulars, about 100 men, to relieve the 6th New York. Zouaves was reinforced en route by Company G of that regiment, which had been posted at Battery Lincoln, and the troops advanced along the beach of the North Shore. He sent the New Yorkers ahead as skirmishers, with orders to protect the right flank of his column. In the pre-dawn darkness, however, the men of Company G somehow got lost amid the sand dunes and were not seen again for the duration of the encounter. Zouaves and his regulars continued their march east along the beach in search of the Confederates. At a point just east of Camp Brown, a large force of Confederates moving east in retreat hit the column from the right and rear. In the darkness, the Union detachment had unwittingly marched past the attacking Confederate battalions. Now Zouaves was blocking their withdrawal. Zouaves quickly realized his predicament. He was cut off from the fort and greatly outnumbered. He swung his detachment to the right and attempted to advance. Withering Confederate fire forced the Federals to fall back toward the Gulf side of the island, and in the process, Zouaves was captured. His detachment, now under the command of Captain John Hilt, took up positions behind the dunes and fought to hold the Confederates back. After a sharp skirmish, the Federals were pushed aside, and the Southerners' escape route was again open. Hilt continued his withdrawal to the south shore of the island. Along the way, he captured the Confederate medical detail left behind to care for the wounded. At about 5 a.m., Brown ordered an infantry company and artillery battery under Major Lewis G. Arnold to march to the support of Zouaves. Arnold, upon learning of Zouaves' capture, rallied Hilt's men and directed a rapid pursuit of the fleeing Confederates. In their hasty retreat, the rebels soon found themselves outflanked and harassed by Arnold's riflemen. As the Confederates boarded the awaiting steamers and barges, the Yankees fired on them from behind the closest dunes with considerable effect. General Anderson, shot through the left elbow, was among the wounded. The rebel soldiers, crowded on the decks of their transports, returned the fire. After some delay, caused by a fouled screw on Nephi, the flotilla pulled out of range of Arnold's rifles and returned to Pensacola. Florida's first major land battle of the Civil War was over. Both sides claimed victory, and accounts of the battle and its resulting casualties varied. General Anderson viewed his expedition as a complete success. He commended the courage and discipline of his men and reported his losses at 18 killed, 39 wounded, and 30 captured. He estimated enemy losses at 50 to 60 killed and about 100 wounded. Bragg, for his part, believed the enemy had been properly chastised for burning Judea. He also reported his expedition as entirely successful, and, like Anderson, believed the enemy losses were much heavier than his own. He commended the troops and their commanders for their gallantry under such arduous circumstances. Bragg observed that 11 of the 13 Confederate dead recovered from the field had bullet wounds in the head, in addition to body wounds, which led him to infer that the disabled men had been executed. In his report, Brown listed Federal casualties at 14 dead, 29 wounded, and 24 captured. He was harshly critical of the conduct of the 6th New York troops, charging that they disgracefully ran and took shelter under our batteries. Regimental historian Gouverneur Morris viewed the matter in an entirely different light. In Morris's biased and mostly inaccurate account of the engagement, Anderson's forces was numbered at 2,500 crack troops. Morris claimed that the 6th did not wildly flee their camp, but fell back in good order, firing steadily, and that, contrary to reports, the regiment had not been stampeded or broken. He wrote that the 6th pursued the fleeing rebels. Morris also exaggerated the number of Confederate dead at 400 and declared that the 6th New York had won a tidy victory. Colonel Wilson, in a similar exaggeration, reported 500 enemy soldiers had been killed or wounded. In his vainglorious account, Morris was highly critical of Brown, blaming him for not preparing for the possibility of Bragg's attack. He believed Brown was the only officer on Santa Rosa Island who did not recognize the almost certain probability of such an attack. Furthermore, Morris contended Brown did not entrench the 6th, did not have their field battery organized, did not rise to the situation as it unfolded, and did not properly press the pursuit. The battle resulted in no strategic gain for the Confederates, but Bragg felt it gave his men confidence, raised their morale, and made them stronger. The raid was also significant in that Anderson had been able to transport a large body of infantry across the bay and advance them to within close range of the fort without being detected. A Yankee regiment was scattered and a camp was burned. Indeed, Anderson's success begs the question of whether a larger force, supported by artillery, could not have accomplished the same feat and then gone on to seize Fort Pickens. In any case, the raid alerted the Federals to the danger, and the Southerners lost the element of surprise. Confederates never again assaulted Santa Rosa Island or Fort Pickens. The Federal invasion of Tennessee in early 1862 caused the Confederates to withdraw from Pensacola. On May 9th, the last Confederates to leave set fire to the naval shipyard and other military installations. On May 10th, acting Mayor John Broshenham surrendered the city to Union Lieutenant Richard Jackson. For the remainder of the war, Pensacola was in Union hands. The Federal Western Gulf Squadron used the shipyard as a base of operations, and Fort Barracas provided a starting point for numerous Union raids and expeditions into Alabama and western Florida. Thanks for watching this episode of Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Like, follow, and click the bell for notifications to ensure you see all of the latest content. As always, let me know if there's any other important events of the American Civil War you would like me to address.